All right, welcome everyone. We're going to begin our event. My name is Michael Berry. I'm director of the Center for Chinese Studies at UCLA, and it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to our virtual conversation with the film director Arvin Chen. Arvin is the director of, at this point, 4 feature-length films, 2 of which are coming soon, 2 of which are out there in the ether. He's won numerous awards. He was educated at Berkeley and then USC, and he has really built an incredible career for himself, mostly in the Taiwan film industry. And so today is a great opportunity to hear his insights, to hear about his artistic trajectory, what he's done, where he's going. We're also going to do some kind of close analysis of some of his films and really get a chance to dig in to his incredible body of work. So I want to begin by thanking Arvin and also thanking our sponsors, the Taiwan Academy, the Taiwan Ministry of Culture, who helped make this particular event possible. But Arvin, thank you and welcome to our virtual stage.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And so I thought we'd begin by going back to the early days and talking about your childhood, your teenage years. What were the formative kind of and touchstone works of literature, comic books, pop culture that really had an impact on you in shaping your aesthetic taste and your eventual decision to pursue a career in film?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in pretty boring American suburbs. So like nothing honestly too unique in terms of like the environment I grew up in. You know, my parents were graduate students from Taiwan. They immigrated to the US in like the mid 70s. And they probably had an interesting life. I think when they were younger and immigrants, like they lived in Philadelphia and Boston, you know, like college towns. But by the time they had me, we basically were living in like a North American suburb, like a pretty middle class, at the time mostly white suburbs. So I grew up, you know, probably my first exposure to like pop culture, like you were saying, was pretty straight up like the 80s. You know, in terms of movies, it was like, you know, Spielberg movies, Star Wars, like pretty basic things. And you know, in terms of literature, I wasn't a huge literature fan on my own. You know, like there were books like, you know, Great Expectations and The Great Gatsby, like these books kind of about like, you know, with like kind of like a bittersweet kind of tone that I was drawn to. And I don't know why, but at the time, like those are the things that really got me as a kid. But again, those were like basically through like English classes. My first love, if anything, was like, I guess more artistic, was comic books. This was like in the era when I was like, you know, my early teens. It was like this big kind of big Marvel revival of like the early 90s. So like artists like Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane. I don't know if comic geeks out there, but that was like a big thing. And like I remember as a kid, like my first really kind of venture into wanting to be anything artistic was comic book art. So I was like, you know, going to comic book conventions, trying to meet like people like Jim Lee, like I was saying, or Art Adams, drawing X-Men comics, Spider-Man comics. This was before like Marvel was totally mainstream. It was just like as a comic book collector. And kind of as a aspirational artist. And then I guess my second foray to anything artistic, also not film related, was I was really into music. Like I had a rock band, basically like, you know, my friends playing in our garage. We were heavily influenced at the time by like, you know, grunge music. So again, like that was something where like for, I guess, an Asian American kid and the middle class Asian American kid, not that common maybe to be into like these kind of things, especially like kind of like the rock music. So yeah, that was like a kind of a big thing in movies, really, like besides like what I think everyone else was kind of consuming. It wasn't that really unique. It was just like, you know, whatever was like the big pop culture things. I mean, like everyone else, like Pulp Fiction came out when I was, I think, in high school, and that was like, you know, it's not again like super unique, but like that was my first interest in like, wow, this is, I guess it would be considered like mainstream art house, where something felt like this is different than what we had been seeing. I know Clerks was like also a big movie where like my friends and I just watched Clerks over and over again. And I couldn't tell you intellectually why when we were kids, but we're just thinking like, oh, this is just such a different thing. Just we've never seen anything like this before. Just people talking. It's a black and white, and yet it was like so funny to us, you know, just like the dirty jokes and like the really like witty dialogue, people just hanging out. So I think stuff like that started to make me feel like, well, like again, movies could be a little bit different, even if Clerks and Pulp Fiction was like the most artistic or challenging things you'd ever seen. For us, like with very like kind of basic mainstream pop culture tastes, it started to feel like, okay, this is something kind of interesting. And I remember just getting so into Pulp Fiction at the time that like I would go to Tower Records and read their magazines about Quentin Tarantino and his interviews. And that's when really like I started to get into, I guess, what you call art house or like foreign cinema, because Quentin Tarantino at the time would say like, you should watch Wong Kar-wai, you should watch Chungking Express, and all these things that I had never ever at the time seen before. My only exposure to Asian cinema, especially Hong Kong cinema, was like through my parents, and that would have been like 80s slapstick Hong Kong genre films, or like Jackie Chan movies, Jet Li movies, much more kind of like commercial Hong Kong cinema, and maybe like a little bit of John Woo. Some of my friends and I were into like I think towards the end of my high school years, like like watching like stuff like Hard Boiled, and The Killer. And that was only because we had seen, Face Off, and like, we went back and watched like some John Woo movies. But it really was like, it's crazy to say, but Quentin Tarantino saying like, oh, you should watch Wong Kar-wai, that like I started looking for these movies. And then like Wong Kar-wai, you read about like, oh, he was influenced by the French New Wave. I never seen a French New Wave movie maybe until like I was like 18 or 19. And then I started watching, all these things. And then that kind of, I guess, love of a cinema I'd never known kind of coalesced with like me going to college. And then as someone in college, you start to think that you're an artist or you have artistic tastes. And that's when I really got had like a deeper dive into what you would call like foreign cinema or art house cinema. Even Taiwanese movies I hadn't really watched as a kid, other than maybe the occasional Ang Lee movie that my parents had watched, or Taiwanese martial arts movies, which were usually a lot more low budget than Hong Kong ones. So I remember like as a kid, like Hong Kong genre films were much more what I gravitated towards.
Great. And you got up to the period when you were 18 or 19, which is when you go to college, and you went to Berkeley and you majored in architecture, which is in a funny anecdote. Years ago, this is over 20 years ago, I interviewed Edward Yang, and I remember him talking about architecture being the perfect marriage between the sciences and the humanities. And later you would work with Edward Yang, and we'll talk about that. But I'm curious, what did your training in architecture bring to your later career in film? Do you feel that it gave you a certain visuality or an attachment to spaces, or a sensitivity to spaces that maybe other filmmakers might not have?
Yeah, I think definitely. At the time, to be honest, I wasn't like, I always considered architecture as like a way to study. I mean, a lot of people do this to study like art in a more kind of conservative environment, conservative in the sense that like, you could make a career out of it. But like there are elements of architecture, especially studying architecture, that make you feel like you're still doing something purely artistic. And because I went to Berkeley, Berkeley is not known for being a very craft oriented or technical oriented architecture school. I think at the time when I went, they used to say that like, and they were proud of this. I think that a lot of people that went to that undergraduate program don't become architects, and not, in a bad way, that it gives you enough of an artistic foundation that, you could do, you could become a filmmaker, you could become, graphic designer, you could become a visual artist, so you could make furniture. So it was kind of interesting because my education at Berkeley was not what you would think of as being like, designing buildings or learning how to draft construction documents. My professors and teachers there were pretty wide range of arty people. I had a really great professor named Ravi from Thailand, and she would show us, at the time, like Godard movies, like, and say like, oh, just see how he deals with time and space. I think the general kind of feeling of like Berkeley architecture undergrad when I went was that like, they just wanted you to understand like the foundations of like design and creative thinking, and going from something conceptual to something that's more, that can be built. So I think that process, and they were really cool about it, which is like the process doesn't have to apply to buildings. It could apply to, films. It could apply to painting. It could apply to furniture making. It could apply to industrial design. How do you take something, how do you take an idea? How do you shape that idea into something tangible? And like, in architecture, the tools of that are, of course, like structure and light and materiality and all these things. But if you remove the tools, it's still the same process. Like in filmmaking, it's like, you go from an idea to just, pages on a words on a page, and that becomes, maybe storyboards, and storyboards become, lenses, and lenses become, actors and light. And so like, I think that looking back was the thing that was most interesting, is that the process of design, or the process of architecture, seemed like it would be something that you could apply to anything, especially the way they taught it. And I don't know if that's what Edward meant, but for sure that's what I felt, which is that he was seeing the marriage of science and science and art. I felt like that, like the science part for me was that methodology, the like, understanding materials and tools enough so that you can create something. Because as much as we want to think that making movies is artistic, it is extremely, extremely technical. Like the better you understand the technical, like it frees you up more artistically, but it's really hard to achieve a certain type of, say, artistry without like a pretty strong understanding of technical. Even if it isn't the director himself, it's like you really have to rely so much on to the technical to create anything. So I think maybe that's what he meant. And if that is what he meant, I think that's for sure what would apply to filmmaking too, from architecture.
And since we already mentioned Edward, after Berkeley, you went to USC, but eventually you end up in Taiwan. And was it your first job working with Edward, or how did that come about? And how long were you working with his company? Can you just share some of that experience with us?
Yeah, it's basically that timeline, except what happened was I graduated from architecture school, and it was really there actually that I found like this love of like a pure love of like, cinema that I didn't have as a kid. I mean, it just had like, again, like the more pop culture version of it. It was really when I was in architecture school that I thought like, well, I don't really love architecture itself, but I do love this process. And the thing I do really love is films. And that's what I really want to try to do. But I just had no understanding of not just filmmaking, but no understanding of how that would even start, like on like a career level, or like on like what is the trajectory? I have no idea. So my kind of what I wanted to do was go to film school, like right after architecture school. And I worked for a little bit, like this was like the .com era, like the first .com era. So I just worked for like doing graphic design because I knew enough about like Photoshop basically to be able to get like a graphic design job in that like early 2000s kind of world. But the goal was to always just go to film school. And I had applied to, without literally knowing not very much about anything, I just applied to USC and NYU because that's the ones that you often heard about. It's like UCLA, AFI, Columbia, NYU, UCLA, of like the bigger film schools that most people who didn't do much research would have known about. And I got into USC, and I got an interview with NYU that I totally blew. And so my backup kind of, because I actually always wanted to live in New York and go to NYU, but I couldn't get in. And so around that time, Edward's film EE came out, and I knew enough about film by then that like, I would hear that, oh, this movie won an award at Cannes, like, it's a Taiwanese film. So I went to go see it in the theater, and like, just one of like the formative experiences of my life was seeing that movie. And I remember telling my mom, oh, there's this Taiwanese filmmaker, it's an amazing film. And she's like, oh yeah, that's he's a friend of my classmates. So if you want to just talk to him and get some advice, like it's easy enough to set that up. So I met Edward that way, basically through my mom's friend, who's his younger sister. And I think again, like I'm not very good at like communicating ambition or life plan. I was just like telling him like, I don't know what I should do. Like I'm supposed to go to film school at USC probably. And he was like, oh, don't go to film school. Like film school will ruin you. He had gone to USC and dropped out, I think, after one semester. So he was like, this, you should not go to film school. Like any creativity you have, or any like intrinsic originality that you have, like as a person, is going to be corrupted, or like it's going to be compromised, and like you won't have any more vision left if you go to film school. So he basically on the spot was like, if you really want, just come work with me in Taiwan. I'm looking for bilingual assistants all the time. Like like I said, I had worked in graphic design and kind of animation a little bit at the time. So he's like, I need someone. I'm going to start doing some more like new media stuff in Taiwan. So I think I was like 21 at the time, maybe 22. So it seemed like, well, if I delayed film school or never went to film school, this would be the chance to do it because I don't have to go right away. So I went to work for them in Taipei, like I think within that month. And I had pushed back.
Animated stuff? I guess Edward was working on Dray Feng and the animated projects at that time.
Yeah, I honestly didn't know much about what he was doing at the time. I just went. I mean, he was like, oh, yeah, I'm going to be doing movies. I got like, animation. I got like new media stuff. So I went there not knowing really what I was getting into. And it was true. He was doing all sorts of stuff. He was developing feature films. He had a media company. He was doing animation. So for about a year and a half, I was just, whatever I could help with my minimal amount of like experience and skill at the time, I would be doing. So it was like, and I think this is just very much a lot of ways Taiwanese directors work, is there isn't so much like delineation between like what you do underneath a director. It's like they have people around them that just like fill in gaps of like, I'm doing this, so do this. I'm doing this, so do this. So it's much more like kind of an apprenticeship, like in like the most like kind of old school way, which is like, you're there just to like help him do what he's supposed to do with his own projects. And like what you learn is kind of like as he's doing it and you kind of fill in the gaps. So.
And are there certain core lessons you got from that time with Edward Yang that kind of carried throughout your career?
Yeah, I would say at the time, probably I took in very few lessons because I was just very, very young. And like, I'd never been on a film set, never been around a director before. So I didn't get a lot at the time, but looking back on it now, just, he's extremely disciplined and uncompromising. And I didn't understand what that would mean until I started making something on my own, like what that means to just be so uncompromising about what you want to make and so clear in your head about what you want to make that like there's like a relentlessness to what it's weird because his movies feel very gentle and like elegant. And they feel very natural, and I mean, they're very constructed, like the actual plotting and like the filmmaking is very tight, but there's like this kind of breeziness to the way he tells stories. But him as a person, as a director, is not like that. He is extremely, extremely, uncompromising. Like everything is thought out. Like every single shot is in his head or storyboarded. So that now looking back after making a couple movies, especially after I made my first movie, I realized like that level of like discipline and just like level of like thinking out everything and like planning out everything in your head and like envisioning everything is not a skill that I have. But like looking back, like that way he functioned and that way he kind of like viewed the world was just pretty now even more. The more I make movies, the more I realize like that's like not everyone has that. And the way his movies they're made like that, I think only because he has that kind of discipline. The other thing is like, he was very temperamental, not like in a mean way. He was just temperamental and like a person who has to have things the way they envision them. Even if I was only just working for him in this company and we weren't making movies yet, but there's like no compromise with him. Like, and I think all of his frustration or when he would get upset about something, it was never at like a person or at something you did. It was just like that he couldn't get exactly what he wanted in his head to be to be translated onto screen or whatever. So again, like that's not a quality I have, and I wish I had more of it. But it does make you appreciate again his movies even more because like he's a guy who would not let go until it was like perfect. So
great. And another legendary filmmaker that you had a big impact on you early on was Wim Wenders, who produced your first film. How did that come about, and what was his role in mentoring you or helping get that first film off the ground?
Yeah, it was it's pretty amazing. I mean, again, like as a much older person now, like I look back and like I can't believe that when I was younger I got to apprentice for Edward and in a way work with Wim. They're going to go down as two of like the biggest like the biggest contributors to cinema of all time. With Wim it was so besides just being a fan of his work and just being like in awe of him as a person, I hadn't anticipated ever meeting him, let alone having him help me with my first movie. And it really just came about because I had made this short film out of USC called May. And through that film, I met a Korean German producer named Ina Lee. And she used to produce a lot of Wim's movies. And I had met her at a film festival, I think through friends. And she had agreed to help me put together my first feature film in Taiwan. And when we were talking about it, she was like, like I'm in touch with Wim Wenders a lot, and he helps sometimes first-time filmmakers as an executive producer and like mentor. Like, I can't promise you anything, but I'll show him your short film and maybe he'll agree, and he knows that like what that means to getting like a first feature off the ground. So she showed him my short film and he was like, yeah, I'll do it. He's very like, chill guy. He's like, I'll do it. And so I met with him. I think it closed now, but there used to be like this diner, like it's like the Hollywood 101 diner. Like it's like in a Best Western hotel,
okay,
like in Hollywood. So I just met with them, like we had breakfast. And like I don't think we spoke much to each other. I think like he was just like having a breakfast, but he was like, again, he's kind of like an aloof guy. And he was like, yeah, like I like your short, like let me see what I can do to help you make it. And it was very, again, he's such a soft person, and so kind of, again, kind of like this arty kind of aloof kind of guy. It just felt very natural. He came to Taipei when we were in pre-production. He met the actors, but it wasn't ever like he was this like dominating force over anything. He just read the script, gave notes. When I finished shooting it, he wasn't there for production. He's busy enough on his own. He would watch the cut. This is back in the day when we still had DVDs. So I would like, mail him like a DVD of like the rough cut, and he would email me back notes, saying like, I think you need to show more city, or again, like just like his personality was very, very soft. He was like, I think like the city should be more of a character. It not anything so specific. It was like very, very like just these artistic kind of gentle notes. Yeah, and then he came to the screening in Berlin when we premiered like the second movie that I made. He came to that screening again, and it's kind of like a relationship where once in a while, like I saw Paris, Texas a few years back on the 4K, so I would write him like a email and just say, hey Vim, I saw the restoration, looks amazing, and he just wrote back like, yeah, it's pretty nice, huh? Like that's about the extent of our relationship now. It's like once in a while I'll email him, and if I'm in Berlin, sometimes get to see him, but that hasn't been the case for a while. Just haven't traveled in a long time. But yeah, he was just like this kind of almost like a artistic godfather that just came in and out of my life at that time when I was making that first movie, and I don't know, it's just like a very natural but very simple kind of relationship. And he does, I guess, if you want to compare, these two masters, like I've never got to see Vim work so much in person, but just their personalities are quite different. I think like, both of them are where they're similar. I think they, I was working with Edward and he was in his 50s, and I was working with Vim when he was probably in his mid 60s, but like they were both like children, like, and I mean that like in the best way. Like they're just like, they never felt like, these were older men. They felt like whatever part of their child, like that was still intact, it was completely there. Like they were still just like, Edward gets excited still just like, about comic books, and excited about like, hanging out with young people and talking about like, basketball, and like this very, very like sweet childlike quality. And I think Vim even more so has that quality too. We would be in Taipei, and like he would see like a street light that he thought was funny, and he would take out his camera, and like, we'd lose him because he stopped like, there, and like would come grab him, and just something about that, like not faked, but like a real, like true childlike wonder about the both of them was pretty amazing. But I think like my instinct is that Edward is much more about like everything he makes has to be in his head first, because I just saw that firsthand, like this kind of like rigor and discipline about things having to be the way he's already envisioned it. And I know just from interacting with Vim, and I think you reading about the way he makes his movies, he's much more about like seeing what the set gives you, what the actors give you, and kind of like responding to, kind of more of like a naturality of like what's happening. And obviously they both make amazing films, but that's also something I've learned too, which is like there's no correct way to make a movie necessarily. I probably fall somewhere in between the two of them, not in terms of talent or skill, but just in terms of like, I like to plan a little bit, but then I like to leave a little bit more to, what could happen. Whereas I feel like they're kind of two extremes of that.
Great. So we're going to start segueing to talk about your first film, but first a program note to our audience. I didn't say anything about the format, which is going to continue like this as a one-on-one dialogue. And towards the end, we're going to open it up for some of your questions. So if you do have a question at any time, on the bottom of your screen is a Q&A box, and you can post your questions anytime during the dialogue. And towards the end, we will start fielding some of the audience questions. I wanted to turn to the relationship between your work and the kind of history of Taiwan cinema, because I don't know if I'm spot on here or not, so you'll have to tell me.
Sure,
but I
sure.
sense this kind of connection with earlier generations of Taiwan filmmakers through your work. Of course, there's the Edward Yang connection, but Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow? We have Xiao Ye, who was kind of the godfather of the new Taiwan cinema movement. And he
Right.
had a significant cameo in the beginning. Au Revoir Taipei, you have Jack Gao, who of course is a mainstay in Ho Xiaoxin's films. You work with Central Motion Picture Company, which was our corporation, which was the production company that made Beautiful Duckling and all the Chongyao movie, and they have such a history in Taiwan. And I just wonder, is that a intentional decision that you kind of want to preserve this? I don't know if it's a nostalgia or it's a kind of homage to these earlier pages in Taiwan history, Taiwan film history through your work.
Yeah, I think it's good. I don't think it was necessarily intentional, but I do feel like, looking back, like maybe more so than some people, it's just because I'm not like purely from Taiwan. Like I'm kind of also like an aficionado of Taiwan cinema, that from the outside, is I do want to, again, without being like too heavy-handed about, like, want to look for things about Taiwanese cinema, the history that I can have fun with, so I think like the other great thing about Taiwan cinema just in general is like it's still, as the industry has gotten bigger, it's still pretty insular in like a very good way. Like it's still very much a community, and I feel like you still hear about, like Xiao Ye's son is like a friend of mine who was a director, so like it's natural that you would, you're like one person removed from him, or someone like Jack Gao, like he always appears in younger directors' movies for fun. I used to Ho Xiaoxian used to have like a filmmaking workshop that I would help teach sometimes. So like all these things is like, because it's such a community and so small, there's a lot of like, this generation to this generation to this generation very naturally, and like a lot of overlap. So I think that it's a nice thing that I just like to have in my movies, but I also feel like it's also a natural extension of just what it's like to be working in Taiwan, where like, you have actors and directors, and you have people from like, the previous generation or from Taiwanese cinematic history kind of still in the community. So it's something where like, it can occur to you like, hey, it'd be fun to get him to come, be in this shot, or be in, come do this. So it's kind of like it's natural, but also it feels like, yeah, there is like something I do love about, incorporating that into the movies.
And so let's talk about your first film, Au Revoir Taipei. It's about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
It came out.
Maybe a little bit more than 10 years, but yeah.
And it, won multiple awards. It kind of put you on the map as an exciting young filmmaker to watch. I'm wondering, especially for our filmmakers in the audience, if you can kind of walk us through the process of getting that project off the ground. As a first-time director, how did the screenplay come about? How did the pitch go? Who did you pitch it to? Where did the funding come from? If you could kind of give us a tour through what that process was like for you.
Yeah, it was, I used to say this a lot, like I wish I had planned it all out a little bit better. It happened to me a lot. I guess it was like learning as I was doing it. So, I went to film school, and at the time when we were going to film school, and maybe it hasn't changed that much, it used to always, for USC at least, kind of like the template or the blueprint for success, or like a career trajectory, was always that you make a short film, you try to get it into like Sundance or something, and then it gets seen, and like an agent signs you, and that agent gets you like like your first Hollywood deal. And I think that's an antiquated kind of model now, but at the time, that's kind of the model that we were kind of aspiring to. And so I tried that. I made a short film. It did not get into Sundance. It got into Berlin, and it was lucky enough to win an award there. And kind of unexpectedly, people started like, and I was lucky that it was at Berlin and not Sundance in a way, because somehow like there was more, I didn't know much about anything, but I didn't know anything about like the world of international filmmaking outside of the US and like, you know, Sundance and go to USC at the time. It's much more about like, you know, how you can make it in Hollywood. So winning this award in Berlin, I started to meet, you know, producers like my producer and friend Ina, who didn't work in Hollywood. You know, she made films for Wim Wenders. You know, so, and it was her just saying like, you know, well, what do you want to do now? Like, you want to make a feature probably, like, do you have a script? And I said, I don't have a script. I don't have anything. Like, I was supposed to get into Sundance to get an agent and I did it. So she was like, well, you need to write something. You need to like, you know, expand. Like, if you don't have any ideas, take your short and turn it into something, like do something. So, if I'd go back in time, like my advice for any young filmmaker now, and I think people are as much smarter than we were back then, is never make a short independent of having a feature attached to that short. Like, you know, whatever you're going to do with a short, because that's what you want to get people, that's what you want to get seen. If people like it, you got to give them the feature length screenplay, which is in that world of the short, or, you know, in the same tone or something like right away, because that's your real shot is to have that piece of material, which I didn't have. So I was lucky that, thanks to the Taiwanese government, I got a grant for winning that award. And it wasn't a lot. It was like $6,000 or $7,000, which was still a lot in like 2004 for like someone coming out of film school, where I didn't have to work for like maybe 4 or 5 months. So I just took that time and like, again, like reverse engineered a screenplay based on my short film. And it didn't really even work then, because my short film, Column A, is like this kind of like Wong Kar-wai romantic, you know, ripoff in a night market in Taiwan. And expanding that into like a 90-minute or 100-minute film, it just didn't sustain itself. So I went back and was like, well, I don't know what I can do this thing. Like, should I add like gangsters? Like, should I do, like, what can I do to make it more interesting? And it became like just a semblance of my short and evolved into like this movie about like, you know, kids running around Taipei at night and like gangsters and dancing. And it was really me just like going back and thinking about things that I had been into at the time, which was like French New Wave movies, and thinking about like how to like make a version of a French New Wave movie in Taiwan. And in terms of how it got made, you know, again, my producer Ina, I didn't know anything about how movies got made. So she was like, well, you need to try to go to like markets, like not film festivals necessarily, just like film markets to get the project out there. So she helped me like, you know, apply to like the Busan film market. We got into the Cannes has a film like development market called L'Atelier. So we got into that. And that was my first foray into like that there's this whole world of international cinema and this whole world of like outside of Hollywood. And that's how movies can get made. So once like that happened, and I had this project that was like, you know, going out to festivals, that got us, and Vim got attached to it as the executive producer. It became something viable enough that we could, you know, apply in Taiwan for like a filmmaking grant. And we got, you know, like a huge chunk of the budget that way first. Again, like I had no idea that's how movies are made sometimes, you know, like, you know, especially a lot of European films are made with like film funds, or not only just grants or co-production funds and all these different things. And I had, again, going to USC, I had no idea that's how movies can be made. They don't have to be studio movies, or, you know, they don't have to be independently financed. They can come from all sorts of pieces. So basically what happened is we just got enough money from the Taiwanese government that we knew we could make the movie. And at a certain point, you know, enough pieces fell into place that we had to shoot it, and we still didn't have money to make all of it. And I think we had an investor that came in and then bailed out right before we were supposed to shoot the first time. So we waited a couple months, and then we thought we had another investor again the second time we were going to shoot, and then they bailed out. And the stupidest thing we did, which somehow worked out, was we decided that if we didn't shoot, we would just lose more money because we kept delaying it. So I asked my mom and all her friends to help cash flow a piece of it. Two of our producers also found money to cash flow a piece of it just to get it through production. And this wasn't a lot of money. It literally was like we needed $300,000, but between like the 3 or 4 of us, we cash flowed enough just to get it into production. And it wasn't until after production that we went and found the rest of the money. And by that time, we had basically cut like 10 minutes together of the finished movie to start showing to people, like I think at Cannes again or whatever, to get like the final piece. So that movie was made again like as a learning process, which is not probably the right way to make a movie. But what was interesting is like it's so different than the American model that I had heard about, for how to make movies. So
Great. One aspect of the film that is quite exceptional is the cast. I mean, it's such an amazing cast. You've got Joseph Zhang, Tony Yang, Lawrence Ke, Jack Gao. If you follow Taiwan film, I mean, these are all kind of A-list actors at that time, and many of them still are. And another thing that's kind of unique about it is it's not, I mean, there really are two leads, but I look at it really as an ensemble film. You got this incredible ensemble cast, and that, again, I don't know if this is intentional or not, but that's definitely a trait of Edward Young's films. You look at
right.
Brighter Summer Day, EE, Terrorizers, all of them are these rich ensemble casts. And I was just wondering if you could talk about because this is a pretty clear decision to not go for the typical, one or two lead characters, but create this tapestry of characters. And can you talk about the decision to go in that direction and the challenges of going in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, I had helped not write anything, but I had helped Edward back in the day. When he would write a script, he would basically, I think this is from his engineering background, he would try out like the script like on a giant whiteboard. Like it looked like an engineering or computer diagram. Like this is all these pieces, and I think I would help him. Sometimes he would write out these diagrams, and I just help him like kind of story edit it into like a document, and like whatever he had been thinking. So I think part of me at the time had maybe thought like that's how stories are written, is like all these like pieces of I didn't even think of it as an ensemble, but that like you would have all these characters like meet and so that was definitely one thing that I think I got from him, even if it wasn't, I didn't even know I got it from him. But then I think it's just secondly, it's a weird thing. It's tougher to write these kind of movies, and it's also easier in the sense that like I think it is much harder sometimes to write a movie just about, let's say, 2 or 3 people, because like every scene has to be about them. But then if you write about a bunch of different characters, it's like you can kind of always bounce back and forth a little bit. Like, one storyline can be a little bit goofier because it doesn't have to sustain like the main drama, you can, when you're editing it, it really helps because you can kind of like configure a little bit more. You have a lot of more leeway. So I think for my first 2 movies, maybe it was just like a natural sense of security too, that like I felt like by kind of dispersing the story into like 3 or 4 different lines, I could play a little bit more in like a way that I wouldn't have to focus so much just on like moving through like 2 characters or 3 characters or 4 characters. So I think it's a little bit of both of it. But just in terms of the cast, we shot it in 2009, 2010. I mean, these were actors that were known, but like now they're all stars, especially like Joseph and Tony Yang. So we could never do that now. I mean, on that budget, it just happened to be at a point where like Taiwanese, these last 10 years of Taiwan and cinema has become more and more commercial, and like a lot of these actors have crossed over into China, so they've become much, much bigger than I could ever afford now. So it was actually nice that in that era, it's like they were just all up and coming, and it wasn't that I knew that they would be stars. It was just like what cool actors were around at the time, and you try to get them, and then most of them somehow became stars, or we just caught them at the right moment, or I would just but it wasn't like we were discovering people. Everyone knew that these guys would really break really big.
Yeah. And how hands-on were you during the casting? I'm sure you had a casting director you were working with, but
yeah, I mean, back in that era, we didn't really have, in Taiwan, they didn't really have like quote unquote like professional casting directors. It was like a friend of mine who was like a theater person that was just like, and again, in that era, it was much easier to get in touch with actors. You just have them come out, hang out with you. Sometimes they didn't have managers or agents with them. You would just like meet them. So I mean, pretty specific about like how I want to cast people, and like we did have a lot of unknowns in that movie too, and like that involved us like again, without the resources of like a whole casting system, like we would go to schools and just like hang out on campus and look for people that looked right, and then ask them if they wanted to come audition. Some people, we did a lot of acting workshops. Like we would just like find unknown actors or like actors that hadn't been on screen before, and kind of do workshops to like figure out like if they could do it. So it was like much more organic and much more smaller scale, and I kind of appreciated that, because and it's a good thing, but as like Taiwanese movies and cinema has gotten more commercial, I think you don't do that really as much anymore. Like now everything has to go through, which it should, but everything has to go through an agent. You have to meet with them, like you have to ask, and it takes weeks to get like a meeting sometimes. So
I want to transition to talk a little bit about the music used in this film and the score. Earlier you talked about being in a punk band, so I assume you've got some musical background and a sensitivity to music. And the score in this film is really quite unique. You work with a composer named Wen Shu, who it feels like there's two sets of accompaniment. You've got on the one hand a violin, guitar, piano, which are used kind of as interchangeably, and then you've got a jazz trio, bass, drums, and piano. But often she'll remove some of those. So there's sections that are just solo drums, which are incredible. And then sometimes you add an upright bass into the mix. Other times it's a full jazz trio. But the way you use music in the film is quite unique, I felt. I mean, a few years later, we had, what was it, The Reverend, that had a full drum? Was that the film that had the full drum score?
Oh, that was same director. It was Birdman.
Birdman, yes. Birdman had the full drum score, but you've got a couple sequences that are just drums, and it's really powerful and effective the way that's used. And just wanted to just hear you talk a little bit about your approach to scoring or working with a composer. How hands-on were you during the music process? Were you in the room when you're mixing all this? And just love to hear your insights on creating the soundscape.
Yeah, so it's again, like it makes me nostalgic for this era where everything was so much more kind of piecemeal and like DIY. So Xu Wen actually was he was a boyfriend of a really good friend of mine who had just graduated from the Berklee School of Music as a jazz musician and like a session musician, I think. And he wasn't a composer. And I remember when I was making this movie, again, like it was much smaller, much simpler era when we were making this movie, even though it's just 10 years ago. And I remember just thinking like I didn't want like score. I wanted the feeling of like a live jazz band over the music, over the movie. And I think like the idea I had was that it shouldn't feel like we scored it. It should feel like we found like an old record from like the 50s or 60s, like an old French jazz record. Just like put songs over the movie. So my friend introduced me to Xu Wen, and he was like, "Well, I'm not really a composer, but like I can. I know a lot of jazz musicians that came back from Berklee, and we can like just jam and like do some stuff." So that's what he did. He just like I asked him to cover some Django Reinhardt songs, like Stefan Grappelli stuff, and it sounded great. And he's like, I can write some stuff in this style, and we can just see if it works. So he just wrote me some melodies and like, this sounds pretty cool. So it was so simple. That was it. He wrote me some really simple melodies that we used as temp when we were shooting it. And then after we finished the movie, he just went in with his like, guitar, and he just or whatever he had at the time, bass, and he just laid stuff over. Or like if he wanted a drum solo, he just like MIDI like a drum solo, and he's like, well, this is the basic thing, but when we record it, I'm gonna hire a really great jazz musician, and he's just gonna go crazy on the drums. So it was, even the recording was just like that. It was like, it felt like there was just a jazz band in front of the screen, and then they were just like watching it and then just playing to it. So it was really cool. Yeah, it's weird. Like I didn't overthink it. I just always thought that it would be fun to have like French style old 60s jazz over the movie, and then found this guy who could do it and he did it really well. And then he became a composer, and he composes for movies and like commercials, and he did my second movie and my third movie. And the second movie, the score is nothing like the first movie, but like now he's a bona fide composer, and he can do orchestration and all this stuff. So yeah, pretty amazing for him. Yeah.
Yeah, the second film, it's full orchestra. I think you had the Taipei Film Orchestra.
Yeah, it's just and again with that movie also, it was just, I think I had imagined like MGM like musicals, like lush orchestral score, and I just gave him a bunch of like MGM musical cues, and like, wouldn't it be cool if we just orchestrated the movie to this kind of feeling? Doesn't really fit the movie necessarily, like on paper. It's like this coming out romantic comedy, and yet I feel like something about like just MGM score would really work. So, he found me all these musicians, like, he created a little symphony and did it. So it's, yeah, pretty cool. Yeah, just like one of the guys that I always keep working with, just because like it's a really nice process between the two of us.
Great. So I'm wondering if you will indulge us a little bit in a kind of masterclass of sorts, where we'll show a clip or two from the film, and maybe you can walk us through your creative decisions when you were.
Yeah, sure.
So if you'll bear with me for a moment while I screen share. Okay, so this is your first feature film. This is a sequence where one of the protagonists is kidnapped by these kind of pseudo gangsters, and we're just going to roll a little section of conversation between these four characters.
说过啦，我以前教台湾打的。把你穿它干嘛？我没有任何。你这人没出团啊！欢迎光临，欢迎光临，欢迎光临。哎，你学超像的。靠背。对啊，去当兵了。你有妹吗？记得上车前要多打几炮。没有啦。没有什么妹啊。就是就我的那个。哪个啊？哪个？没有。那梅亚是谁啊？同事啊。他叫什么名字啊？桃子。桃子。桃子的。卡哇伊呢？对啊。那你什么时候要去啊？差不多了。那知道你要去当兵了吗？不知道哎。女生听到这个，美照马上脱下来。真的吗？对啊，你就跟他说，没有，我去当兵了，我只想让你知道，我会在那里想。这样就对了。对啦，这样讲就没有问题。真的吗？不然你以为他怎么每次都把得到没啊？其实我根本不用当兵耶。妈，打麻将？我要打。所以。
Okay, so that's a portion of the sequence. The reason I picked this one, it feels pretty straightforward, right? But you're not doing a typical over-the-shoulder shot. You're doing this straight-on shot. There's a snappy pace to the humor, right? And of course, you don't have four cameras set up. And so, I mean, talk about the setup. Talk about why you chose these to have the camera head on. The way that Ko Yulan's character kind of interrupts it at the end. I just love to have you break some of this down for us.
Yeah, I remember at the time, I mean, we were shooting more than two cameras. I mean, I think we were always shooting only one camera. I think this whole movie was mostly one camera. So you're right, like we weren't like covering it like, with multiple cameras. I think it came from just this. So like, I think the setup for that situation was like kind of a bit of an homage, maybe a ripoff of Shoot the Piano Player. I think where like someone gets kidnapped. And like they talk about like love, or maybe I don't remember exactly, but it was like that idea that I thought was funny, that like, there's this kid that gets kidnapped, and then in the Taiwanese version, they're playing mahjong together and just like hanging out, like as if they're just all like bros. And then I just kind of like what you were saying, I thought it just would be funny if it's not this like really, like when you start like covering it in over the shoulders, it starts to feel a little bit too realistic. And I wanted to have like kind of like a poppiness, like it is kind of like funny that like everything is just like dead on, in this exact same frame of all four characters. And even when the fifth guy comes in, he's also the exact same like frame as they are. So it's kind of like you're seeing like these, almost like seeing like slides being shuffled. It's like pop, 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 pop as they're talking, and all these cuts. And then suddenly like the fifth card comes in, is the exact same shot. And then we cut out and show you that like, they're in this room. So I think it was just that idea that it would be funny that they're talking about love and girls and how to get laid, but like they kidnap this guy and like they're acting as if nothing's happened, and then the fifth guy comes in and kind of breaks their kind of like the vibe that they have.
Yeah, I mean, it's the good illustration of the illusion of cinema, because it feels so natural, this conversation, and there's a humor, there's a flow, and yet you can imagine during the shoot, they're just saying one or two lines, then you're breaking down, getting the other guy's lines, breaking the other guy's.
Yeah, totally. Especially, when we were shooting on film, we didn't have the budget for 2 cameras. And when you're doing that, like, you're right, it's actually super tedious and kind of, it's a little bit taxing on the actors because literally it should feel like they're having this conversation in real time and they aren't. They're doing it 4 times. And then 4 times, probably, we're shooting film, so we couldn't do many takes, but let's say at least 3 takes. So doing like 4 times 3. So it's a lot to keep up that kind of banter and make it feel like it's happening in real time. As I've been shooting more stuff like with 2 cameras, especially on the last you guys just saw, there's like a purity to shooting with 1 camera because like you really are just focusing on this one thing. And like you're saying, like the angles for that, like I don't think you can shoot with 2 cameras to get those angles. It'd be really, really tricky because it's too dead on.
Right.
So there's like a beauty in that, but then at the same time, it is definitely less taxing on the actors if you could shoot 2 cameras and you are getting like the same performance in the same moment. So I think there's advantages to both, but when you're shooting in like this kind of, I'd say like heightened, a little bit more design style, it really is nice to still shoot 1 camera because you're just focusing on like the composition and just like, kind of get a little bit more design. When you get 2 cameras, sometimes you have to compromise a little bit more on the framing and the lighting, unfortunately.
Great. And why don't we do one more scene from the same film? We'll look at the sorry for the spoiler. This is the last scene in the film, so
it's fine.
Susie. Susie. Susie.
Okay, so again, I'd love to hear you kind of walk us through, you're getting tighter and tighter on your female protagonist, Susie, there as the scene plays out. We have this incredible transition from a realist style to a kind of almost magical realist style or a dream sequence in that last moment. But you could just walk us through the creative process of putting that scene together.
Yeah, I think, because so much of that movie, revolved like around the setup of being in a bookstore. And I think just to go back more, I guess conceptually, like, this was shot in like a 24-hour bookstore in Taipei that has a lot of meaning to a lot of people because it actually, sadly, it's closed now, but it used to be this bookstore that people would hang out at night. So I always thought it was like kind of I think a romantic place, but in the context of that movie, it's just where the two protagonists meet. And always in the back of my mind, like I always wanted to end it in this bookstore, but like you're saying, like somehow break reality somehow in the bookstore. So it was really just that, is like the idea that like, as at a certain point, like we start to like abstract it a little bit with just like, we went in, I think it's shot by shot, but we started to like make all the books more and more color coded. So by the end, especially like the last couple of close-ups, all the books are just, they're color coordinated like in a way that it's not realistic at all. So it's like that in combination with like, we get tighter and tighter. We also start like doing slight over cranks, like, we start going to like slow motion, I think also slower and slower and slower. And then the last shot being like the shot where like all the books now, like in that wide shot are they're completely color coordinated, like, and we're doing like this little push in on them, and like there's people dancing. So the idea was that like we are going, like you were saying, like it's reality, and then as soon as he sees her, the music comes in, we start doing these dollies that get tighter and tighter with slow motion. But I think in a weird way, what really sells it, but you don't notice as much, is the books. Is like the books go from being like, like your bookshelf basically to it's all like pastels and all color coordinated. So it's like the kind of the subtle way, I think, of like removing us from reality that I think not everyone picks up on, is like that bookstore now doesn't look like the real bookstore anymore.
Great. And we're going to come back to this theme of kind of magic realism and dream sequences later. But I want to move on to the second feature film, Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow? And the leads here are Richie Ren and Mavis Fan, who initially came to prominence not as actors, but as pop stars. I remember when I was a student in Taiwan, a long time ago, they were, big popular singers. And I'm just wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the process of casting them, what it was like working with them. And I think there was also a question in the Q&A about them. How did you meet them?
Yeah, cool. Well, so by my second movie, I was working with this producer named Lilia, who actually produces a lot of big Taiwanese movies. And what happened was, she read, it's a little different process than Au Revoir Taipei. I had actually written a full-on script between Au Revoir Taipei and Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow. I had written like 2 or 3 different scripts, but Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow became the script that was the most complete. So I basically showed her almost like a 95%, 90% completed script, had her come on as producer, and together we talked about like, well, who would be cool, actors for these 2 roles. And I actually, Richie Ren wasn't my idea. It was her reading the script and saying like, oh, he would be really great for this. And then Mavis, I think, was my idea, thing like, oh, I think Mavis would be great, even though she's like, a little bit of like a rocker type pop star. And what is always interesting to me is in Asia, I think, as a lot of people know, pop stars and actors and entertainers, or it's all kind of like nebulous. Like you kind of have to do all of them. I mean, often if you're a pop star, you have to act. If you're an actor, even if you don't really, you're not much of a musician, you have to put out like a pop album. So it's like something where like it's more nebulous. So I really like it because it usually means that pop stars have acted before. And there's just like a quality of, like anyone that can become a pop star, they usually have the charisma to be able to hold themselves on screen. And then what I like about it is like sometimes it's a little bit more of like a surprising choice sometimes to cast them. So I met with Richie. I think, he took us out to dinner, and he was just, I didn't know him personally, but he had like a sweetness about him. He's known more as an actor for like doing Hong Kong triad movies. He usually plays like badass cops or whatever triad members. He had definitely never played like a just kind of a boring white collar middle class gay man for sure. So he was like, I don't know if I can do this, but if you think I can do it, I'll give it a try. And what really drew me to him, without knowing him personally, was just he had just like this inherent sweetness about him that I didn't know existed, because I had never seen him play this kind of role. And with Mavis, again, in real life, she's much more of like she has tattoos all over her body. She's like a very cool, just really cool. And she does not seem like a middle class repressed mother at all. She's not a mother. But something about like there's like an like kind of like a melancholy, just to the, I don't know, it's like some kind of like melancholy intrinsic to her soul or something that like I felt like would just really help. And I knew that there would be a dream sequence in the movie that I really wanted a singer for. So that was it. And then, you know, it was a little bit of stunt casting in the sense that like I don't think people were expecting Mavis and Richie Red to play like a boring middle class couple. So that to me was always a kind of a fun challenge, like not just from like, you know, performance, but from just aesthetically, how could I make them into these two characters that are nothing like them in real life? So that was basically how it came about. Yeah, they were fantastic to work with, honestly. Like you know, to this day I'm in touch with both of them, and they're just I think the thing about the two of them that I really appreciate, especially Richie, who's like, you know, pretty big pop star, not just in Taiwan, but like, you know, Greater China, everywhere, is just like they're really down to earth and sweet. Like they don't behave like the way you would think. I don't know any other pop stars really, but like you wouldn't think that they're so down to earth, and they really are. So really like had a wonderful experience with them.
Great. And, you know, at the core of the film, it's really about love versus duty, right?
Yeah.
That's the kind of tension that's playing out here. Do you pursue the kind of your obligation to family or pursue your own desires? And that's a theme that has been there since the very early days of Chinese cinema. There's even a film, an old black and white pre-liberation film called Lian Ai Yi Wu, you know, Love and Duty.
Right.
There's two stars on the Milky Way, Yin Han Shuangxing, also about this tension. Even you look at Ang Lee's The Wedding Banquet.
Right.
Same predicament, right? Do you please your parents by marrying a girl, or be true to yourself and come out of the closet and be with the man you want to be with? And it's so hard to do something new with that because it's been done and redone so many times. And yet you were able to find a kind of innovative twist here, which kind of it's a queer twist and a feminist twist at the same time in terms of how you dealt with that theme. And could you talk about, was that something you were thinking about? How do I approach this with a freshness and challenge kind of traditional conceptions of how this has been done in films previously and kind of do something innovative?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I know the start of that movie, or the idea for that movie, just came about because I had a gay friend in Taiwan who told me about, like, you know, I don't know if this is true anymore. Hopefully it isn't, because I think the world has become more progressive, hopefully. But that, you know, there were men in Taiwan that would be basically, you know, gay in their youth, and, you know, actively gay in their youth, and then like kind of go back into the closet in their 30s and, like, you know, marry either like a childhood friend or an unsuspecting woman that, you know, didn't know of their past, and have a family. And then I always just thought, like, well, that to me was kind of an interesting thing as for a story, because I don't think I had seen it exactly like that, whereas like someone had kind of gone back into the closet and then become you know, created a family, and then somehow came out of the closet again, like, but like, you know, in their middle age. So that was, to me, like, you were talking about like love and duty, and I had thought about more just like, you know, what, like love and family, like can you actually have a family and be like a good father, and you know have created the family, and, you know, have some kind of affection with your wife, but it's not love, it's not like, you know, like romantic love. And what would it feel like to have romantic love again? And would that feel like, almost, even if you're like a 40-year-old man, like would that feel like puppy love? You know, would that feel like, what would it feel like? And that, I think that's where like kind of like the musical, like kind of that MGM kind of like pastel-y, lush musical feel came out of that idea that, like, well, what if it felt like that? And that was really what I thought the movie was about. And then as I was making it, I realized that it's much more about Mavis and his wife. Like, and that's where I don't think I understand feminism enough to be able to say that I had even considered that. It was just more of like or feminist theory. It was just like an intrinsic thing that I realized that, like, I feel more for the wife than I feel more for the man in this situation. And then I think all the things that I like about the movie most are that because I think that's the thing that's really kind of interesting to me, is that, like, she tells him she wants a divorce, and she's the one that, like, you know, has to be the active person to, like, free him. And I always thought that was the more moving thing about the movie, is like that she makes the decision that, like, you know, she tells him that we're still family, but, like, you know, I want a divorce from you. So I just thought like that yeah, I don't know how I came about that, but like I remember even shooting it like I like that was my favorite scene. That would maybe tells him she wants a divorce. So yeah, and I never thought of it comparing to other films. Like I think of course Wedding Banquet is like a very for sure, like it obviously must have an influence on it because like there's weddings in it, there's like parents and all this stuff. But I had always just thought of it as like what would it feel like to be have a family and yet you still want to come out again and you never thought you would again, and what would that feel like?
Right. There's one female protagonist, not Mavis, but another actor in the film, where she's in her depression. She starts binge watching K-dramas, and eventually you again have that slippage between real life and fantasy, and these K actors start appearing around her. I was surprised when I watched the credits that you actually had an entire Korean unit.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what that was like and what that process was like?
Yeah, it was I had written it as a K-drama. I think my homage or my ripoff or inspiration, whatever, was Proposals of Cairo. When Jeff Daniels comes off the screen. So I just thought it would be. I think at the time I had friends, women in their 30s, who were like, they would have relationship issues and like binge watch K-dramas. I think that's even more probably prevalent now. And I just thought it would be funny if like similar to Purple Rose of Cairo, it's like instead of this Jeff Daniels coming off the screen, it's like a Korean K-drama star coming off the screen. And then that left us with like the challenge of, well, we have to have a K-drama. And I just thought like, well, I'm probably never going to direct a K-drama. Like it's my only chance ever to like do that. So yeah, luckily like my producer was cool with us like spending some money to go to Korea and shoot it. And one of our co-producers, the same one that produced Au Revoir Taipei, she's Korean, so she helped us put together like a little mini crew. I just told her, I just want to go to the most generic locations in Seoul, like the ones that everyone shoots at. Like just find me the most generic like locations that every K-drama shoots at. So we went and we just shot those scenes.
And then you mentioned the score a little bit, but it's the same composer, Wen Shu, but this time you went for this orchestral kind of palette. And I love the way that there's these swells and stops. And was that you, or were you directing your composer that's the kind of the approach you wanted? Because it's not a traditional full-on score for certain sequences. You kind of have these punctuated orchestral moments, and then it pulls back.
Yeah, I think I don't know if I don't think I understood the music specifically so much that I could tell him like, it has to be like this. I think we just found a lot of references, like again from like old 60s 50s musicals, and we listened to them together and like, well, this could be kind of an interesting thing. But then when he was actually writing it, he would say like, well, I think this should swoop up and then stop and we drop out, or like he would maybe in terms of instrumentation he would say like, like we just have an oboe sustain here, stuff like that. But I think the challenge was us like figuring out like, what does it mean to have like this less orchestral score? Like what does it feel like, and how do we modify it so that it's not so weird to be over like a Taiwanese coming out rom-com, like using that such a specific kind of like style of music? How do we still make it feel like it should be like this? So that was definitely the trick.
And this theme we keep mentioning, this kind of dream sequences, magical realism. We talked about that with the bookstore sequence in the end of your first film. We talked about it just now with the K-pop. They kind of occasionally appear in so much of your work. And I thought it might be fun to show a clip from Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow, where we have another flourish like that. And we can talk more about your approach to kind of challenging everyday reality with this type of dreamlike visuality. So let me share screen again. And so this is a sequence where Richie Ren is just seeing his boyfriend, and the boyfriend's leaving. And so let's.
到时可以见你吗？可以啊。那下期见。好。
Okay, so a beautiful sequence, and I let it go a little bit because I think this next shot is also, there's a beautiful symmetry how you kind of pan down, which is a nice transition. But walk us through how the conception of this and then the execution, what went into carrying that shot out. You're muted, sorry.
Yeah, the concept was always that we would have, again, like I was saying, like my imagination of what it might feel like if you were a middle-aged father and husband, but like you still like, thought that like you were done with like romantic love and like comes back into your life. And I was looking just for like a simple, hopefully not too, I mean, okay, it's a little over the top because he like floats up, but like the idea that like there would be like a break in reality just for like a little bit of a moment. So we knew that it was just like we were internalizing what it might feel like, that moment might feel like. And I was looking at, to go like with the idea of musicals, I was looking at like, Singing in the Rain. They do like these shots with like, people get onto cranes. There's like a Bjork video I think Spike Jonze made where also like Bjork steps onto a crane. And I just thought like, well, maybe that would be kind of an interesting thing to do this shot. Like it's almost like one longer take where, like he has this little kiss and then like we're on a street in Taipei and like it's almost like you don't really even feel it that he's kind of like lifting up until like you're like, okay, wow, why are we like 5 stories above the city? So it was just wanted that feeling of like it's just like a little bit of a break for a second, and then that there's like the reality kind of just slips away for a moment and we're just inside his head, but we visualized it. To achieve it, actually, I think it's a pretty standard shot because it's been done, but it did involve some pretty heavy technical, like I was saying, like it involved some pretty heavy technical work. So I think what we had, it was like basically a crane, on like heavy track. And then we had a Steadicam operator following Richie backwards. And then as he gets on, so basically he follows him backward, and then the Steadicam operator steps onto the crane first. And I think what we did was like a slight speed change as it gets onto the crane, and then they go up together, and that's pretty much it. And the crane is on tracks, so it goes back on like this with a Steadicam operator here and Richie right in front of the camera. And like one of the beauties of film is that sometimes like the speed is just a little off and you get like lights flickering. So like that was just like a lucky accident that like as the speed is changing, you like the lights flicker a little bit. Again, like kind of more of a magical realist feel. And then you're right, like that little camera move back to reality. It was always designed to be like, well, that was just a moment where he had like a break from reality. And when we see him go back to his sad apartment, like that camera move is to like, like, well, that didn't really happen, obviously. And like now we got to kind of just, he's back down again. And it's just like his life is this mundane middle-class life again. So
yeah. And we see that kind of dynamic play out in different ways in the film as well. I mean, there's another couple who's featured, San and his girlfriend or fiance. And there's that one sequence where San creates this elaborate vacation kind of set in the middle of the street to try to woo her to win her back. And of course, that's in a realist context, but it's very over the top and magical in a way. And that results in her rejection, and she walks away. And then at the end of the film, we're in his messy boxed up apartment, and that's where she accepts him. And so there's this kind of tension or this interesting interplay between these fantastical, beautified, dreamlike sequences and then the grittiness of everyday reality, and the way you kind of create this tension between sequences like that.
Yeah, I think what I liked, I haven't watched the movie in a long time, but I think one of the things I do always still really like about Will You Still Be Tomorrow is that I did like whatever we did to achieve this kind of, like you're saying, like kind of balance between like what's reality and what's not, and how it kind of slips in and out. but hopefully still feels like it's, you know, of the same world. I think that's something that I always liked about that movie that we tried to do.
Yeah. Just a note to our audience, my questions are starting to wind down, so it's your turn to really think of your questions, and please put them in the Q&A box, and we're going to be turning to you in just a few moments. But I do have a few more questions, and a moment ago you mentioned Bjork and a music video, and you've actually directed a couple music videos. I'm wondering if that experience taught you any tricks or lessons that you were able to extract and apply to your filmmaking, and if there's any concrete examples you could give us of that.
Yeah, I think, you know, music videos, I've done quite a bit of commercials, which I would say don't allow for much room for experimentation or playfulness. Commercials are unfortunately just, you know, very much like you are just delivering product. But in terms of music videos, you know, I think just it's really just a lot of like visual storytelling, experimentation. You know, you can do so many things with like, you know, camera, so many things with just like production design, so many things with like just like the way you stage things that helps me a lot. Mostly because like it's very low risk, because like it just has to look cool or fun, and then you can, and if that works, you have to make you have to make the pop star or whoever look good. But yeah, I think there's like, just, you know, I've done stuff with like playing with slow motion, stuff with playing with like weird lighting, playing with like weird editing. All of those things I would be less, probably less willing to try like for the first time on like a feature movie, just because like you don't know if it'll work. Whereas on a music video, like it doesn't really matter as much. So I think it's more of that, you know. My first two movies were shot on 35mm film. Increasingly, I've been shooting on, you know, I did shoot on the Alexa for a lot of the commercials. I shot my third movie on the Alexa. The fourth movie I shot on this new camera called it's like the Sony Venice. It's like usually in between all these things, trying out like, you know, different cameras and stuff like that is also something you want to do on music videos or commercials, and not lenses. You want to try all those out in things that are less consequence than a feature film. So that's always been something cool to do too.
Great. You know, and tonight's conversation is kind of awkward because you have 4 feature-length films. We're only really discussing 2, right, because the other 2 were just completed and I haven't seen them. They're not released yet, but I'm hoping maybe you can tell us a little bit about these 2 films that you've recently completed. And I think you might even be willing to share a clip from one of them with us.
Yeah, totally.
So maybe just start. Mama Boy is done and about to be released and about to hit some festivals.
Yeah, so it's premiering in Italy at a festival called the Far East Film Festival, I think in a couple weeks. They invited me there. I was planning to go, but I think just because of COVID and travel, I'm still unfortunately not going to be able to go for a premiere, which is the first time, unfortunately, I've never been at the premiere. So it's a little bit of a bummer, but yeah, I shot this movie in 2021. I shot this movie in 2021, and it's just completed and it's starting to roll out, I think, over the summer. I think we're gonna have a big premiere in Taipei in June, and then it releases in theaters in August. And hopefully it'll start playing, you know, some US festivals, more European festivals, and eventually hope to, you know, it'll be on some streaming platform somewhere. But yeah, the basic story is, so it's about a 29-year-old kid, a young man who has like a very dominating mother, and he's never had any like girlfriends or any like, you know, love or sexual experience. And so he decides to go lose his virginity in like a brothel or love hotel, and he can't go through with it. And he actually instead falls in love with like an older woman running the love hotel. So it's kind of like a romantic comedy drama, basically about like their relationship. And yeah, that's basically the genesis of the movie. It is different than my other 2 movies in that it's not really an ensemble. There's only really 2 main characters, and at the most, I would say 4 main characters. So it's a much more smaller scale film. It does probably have elements of magical realism and a little bit of like, you know, surrealism, but it's also just like I think a little bit more contained in this little tiny world. So yeah, hopefully it'll be out somewhere in the US for people to see soon.
What was the either greatest challenge or greatest learning experience making Mama Boy?
It was, I mean, because so in between Will Stuff Tomorrow and Mama Boy, I had been trying to get, and literally probably there's like 4 or 5 movies that I had been at different levels of almost trying to make, some that were in pre-production, some that never got off the ground with the script, some that were going to shoot and something collapsed. So I hadn't made a movie in a long time. So that was one of the biggest challenges, just like, I'd done commercials and stuff like that in between, but ramping up to make a feature film again was a little bit harder than I thought. Just I forgot how hard it is to make a feature film. But I think one of the challenges also just I was used to making more ensemble movies, and then this one really was supposed to be kind of like a more intimate movie, and it took away some of like the tools that I was used to working with, but I think in a good way, because it was a much more kind of pulled back movie. So I think that was one thing. And then the fun of it was really just making movies again. Unfortunately, it was also during COVID, so we were all wearing face masks, and I think that really weighed down, like more than I thought it would. I think just like, everyone having to wear masks, something about that, just like, I just like seeing people's faces. I mean, even the actors, they would wear masks until we were shooting them. But yeah, I just forgot like how much interaction and how much I get from just seeing people. And I hope people seeing me, like actors can't really see me like smile like after a good take, or so stuff like that. I think it hit me a lot harder than I thought it would.
Yeah. And you just mentioned that limbo period where you were trying to get some projects off the ground. Earlier, you talked to me about a period in mainland China where you were trying to explore some projects. Do you want to share some of your experience working in the mainland or trying to get projects off the ground in the mainland industry and the challenges there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this was typical, not atypical of the Taiwanese filmmakers in like the mid 2010s, but like there was a while where it felt like everyone would be making co-productions, or like, the Chinese market would become a bigger market. And there was like a brief couple of years where it really felt like there was, there were less political issues and less cultural issues, and really felt like there would be like a little bit more interchange between China and Taiwan in terms of just filmmaking. And it used to be really great, like we would have these festivals where people would filmmakers come from China, and Taiwanese filmmakers go over there, and like it felt like a great time to make movies that could play in both markets, not just for the market itself, but just like culturally, it seemed like the world was opening up a little bit more. And it was at that time that I had, again, various scales of movies trying to get made. And I think the biggest challenge was there's just a lot of money flowing around back then. And it seemed like things would get made. And I think all that money flowing around actually made it harder to get made, because like you just couldn't tell what was like a real project and what was like a fake project, and what people were throwing money at, but like they didn't really care if like the thing got made. And I had worked for, big American studios like Disney trying to get stuff made. And I had worked for Alibaba, which is, a big Chinese studio. And it just became like, what I realized now is just like, everyone was wanting to make movies, there was just so much money flowing in that like, it was really hard to discern what could really get made. And then the last couple of years, this is like pre-COVID, politically, culturally, things had a serious shift. And I think the Chinese market became much more insular. And that was about the time that like I kind of pulled back anyways, but it just became clear that like, China's market, for bad or for worse, was kind of self-sustaining in the way that they didn't really need outside filmmakers so much anymore. And they didn't really need like the exposure of, let's say, Western audience, let alone a Taiwanese audience. So by that time I had kind of not only given up, but I think I had all realized that like it wasn't the place for me to try to make movies, unfortunately, although I would have loved to. And I got really close with a couple projects.
And do you want to show, is Mama Boy the clip that you got queued up for us?
Yeah. So I can show, this is like a 1-minute clip from Mama Boy. It's, so I was saying, it's like about this young man that falls in love with a woman that runs the Love Hotel. So hope this will work. You guys seeing this okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
乐姐，要不要我送你回家？
没关系，我坐计程车就可以了。你真贴心。
请问你要坐到哪里？
锦州街，谢谢。
乐姐，我以后还可以来找你吗？
当然可以啊，欢迎随时到旅馆找我。再见。
再见。
So that was it. That's the first time anyone's seen anything from Mama Boy.
Great, thank you. We look forward to seeing the film. But you have another film though that you just wrapped, and that's Loveboat Taipei. That's a literary adaptation, right? And is that your first work adapted from source material? I think everything else was original screenplay.
Yeah, that's my first time working with anything that I didn't write, and I didn't write the screenplay either. So the screenplay was already written. Someone else adapted it. So that was definitely more of like a for hire job. Whereas I came onto the project after it was like well developed and basically about to shoot. It was very different. Honestly, it was a way different challenge than I've ever had, because almost less of a creative challenge than more of just like a process challenge. It was much more, whereas like my role was as a director, not like, I think with my own movies, I feel like it's all, whether I'm co-writing or writing myself, like originating the project, it's very much like a movie that I kind of I oversee creatively and technically, like from like start to finish. This felt much more like, I was a piece of like a bigger kind of machine, which I think, again, interesting experience. Maybe helps me realize like what kind of movies I want to keep making and not making, I think, in the sense that, I feel like some part of me still selfishly wants to like do stuff that I originate. But I would say the other thing that was quite liberating was like, it was kind of fun to just come in and just say like, well, I'm a director and I'm responsible for this. And, there are things above me or things that I'm not necessarily in control of, or I have the final say in, but I have a job to do, and it's to do this as well as I can and find like, find things that are still interesting. And I think that I can still add and make unique within the context of like kind of a bigger project.
Great. So I think maybe it's time we bring some audience members into the conversation. And so the first question we have is from Kang Sheng. He's a UCLA film student from Singapore, who also is a director who's made a lot of shorts. And he asks, what changes have you noticed in your process over the making of your films?
I think just overall, I've started to become a lot less controlling than I used to be in terms of movies. Like I know with Mama Boy, I used to storyboard every single shot. By the time I got to Mama Boy, and especially on Loveboat, the fourth movie, I started to really let go a little bit more about like the idea of controlling everything with the storyboards, at least. And I think it became a thing where like, one, just the nature of time, I started to realize I don't have the time. I used to be able to, like as a younger man without like a family and like without like a kid, I had much more time to just like be all the time focused on like every single thing has to work. In terms of like, I had to envision all this stuff. But then by the time I got to the third movie and then the fourth movie and shooting them back to back, I realized like there actually is a real benefit to just getting on the set and just seeing what actors give you and seeing what location gives you on that day. And I never had that sense of security or confidence to do that until Mama Boy. And I think some of the best moments of Mama Boy are like, things where I just didn't know what I was going to shoot. I mean, I had a general idea of the scene, but like just to let things happen. I will say that to do that, you need a really good DP though. Like, I think you can't do that without like a really strong DP who has that kind of like, that tangibility.
Great. And this is from, I hope I'm saying his name right, David Guterman, asking about your language background. Do you speak, write Mandarin fluently? Or how do you work with that? I'm interested in your process. And did you, I assume you grew up kind of in a bilingual, bicultural family, but to what level was your Mandarin when you hit Taipei and started working with Edward Yang? And was that another kind of challenge in terms of the language issue?
Definitely grew up in a bilingual family, although still very much more American, I think, than like, Taiwanese in terms of the two cultures. I did speak some Mandarin as a kid, and I think probably better than probably most Asian Americans or Chinese Americans, Taiwanese Americans. It really didn't get much better until I was in Taiwan, working in Taiwan, especially the spoken component. The thing that I've never been totally able to do is write in Chinese. It's really tricky language to learn, I think, unless I've never taken like, besides like, Chinese school as a kid, I've never taken like kind of more, official language lessons. I wish I had at a certain point. So I can read it okay, like conversational Chinese. I can type conversational Chinese. For screenplays, I still need someone to help me translate. I still write in English. More lately, that's been my wife, who's also a screenwriter. So she helps me a lot, either as a co-writer or with translation.
Brian Young asks, we are in some interesting times. Yes, we are. Content is becoming more borderless. After having worked on a Hollywood production and with this opening up of Asian American stories in the industry, do you think you want to work more out West, or do you prefer working in Asia? Perhaps helping to build upon the internationalization of Taiwanese cinema?
Yeah, I would really want to do, Loveboat is an example, not originated with me, like I was saying, but like that's in a template of something that I would really like to do more and more, which is like an American film shooting in Taiwan or with Taiwanese elements. Because I feel like with my background, I think that's what I can do that other people may not be able to do right now, which is, those kind of stories or that kind of filmmaking. Like one of the things I did really appreciate about Loveboat is like I used a Taiwanese crew, almost 95% Taiwanese crew, to make a North American movie. And it was difficult, but there's also something really rewarding about that process, because I don't know that there are many people that could help kind of steer that process just creatively and also logistically. So I think stuff like that I would be really interested in doing. Yeah, and I think, like, again, it's the sad thing about China is like I think that increasingly the world is more and more borderless in terms of filmmaking, but China as a market seems to be more bordered, which again, we were all hoping that it would become like a bigger market, but I think at the same time it's clearly like it works fine as a self-sustaining market. So
this is from Jishin Lin, who asks how to convey characters' personalities through dialogue and other ways when filming about different characters. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the trick is just if the character is fleshed out enough in your mind, when you put them in situations, like there's like a natural way that they will talk. I think it's really hard, and I've had that problem before with writing dialogue. If you're not really sure what the character is like I think that's always where like you just keep writing dialogue over and over again and fixing it, and it doesn't really work or sing. So I feel like it's always trying to figure out exactly what the character is like, whether it's in the script or on paper or just in your mind before writing that dialogue, and then it's much easier to write it that way.
Great. And just a reminder to our audience, we only have a few more questions in the queue. So if you have a question, great time to put it in the Q&A box. This one is from someone you know, or at least someone you know his son. So this is Dong Ce, and his son is Chi. And Dong Ce asks, my wife and I brought my mother-in-law to see your film Au Revoir Taipei in LA 10 years ago. She introduced us to meet you before the screening. We all enjoyed the film. We also went to see Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow. Our whole family are big fans of yours. Could you share with us some of your most beloved movies and directors?
Yeah, my most beloved director used to be Woody Allen, but unfortunately, I don't know, he's a little bit problematic, I think, these days. And it hurts me only in the sense that like it is like seeing someone you really admired and realizing that like, you've turned a blind eye to some of his personal failures and like, personal issues and problems and the way he's harmed other people. So that being said, like my favorite movie, I think out of that context is still probably Manhattan, and I can't really watch it the same as I could anymore. So maybe it's not really my favorite movie anymore, but it definitely used to be up there. I think Brighter Summer Day by Edward Yang is still, that's the movie that every time there's a print of it, I can still sit in the theater for 4 hours and like totally be immersed in that world. So other director, maybe more recently, like a movie I keep coming back to all the time is Inside Llewyn Davis, just like something more recent, last 10 years. And I don't know what it is about that movie that like it really, really resonates with me. Like I just watched that movie over and over again. I just feel like that's the last 10 years or so. That's like the most, something about that movie just really, really hits me. Like maybe it's like the struggle of like a mediocre artist or that world of like 1960s folk New York, but something about that movie is like just really, really magical to me.
Great, thank you. This is from Cheng Shui-Yan, and she asked, thank you so much for a fantastic dialogue, dear Professor Berry and Director Chen. You were educated in the US, but most of your films are based in Taiwan. Will you make some films based in the US in the future? And what is the most distinct difference between Taiwanese and American filmmaking models or modes?
I would definitely like to, and I've tried, and I almost got an American movie off the ground a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, and I think I would still like to. The reason I hadn't tried before is I just thought it was not, it was something that like, I do like to make kind of movies that I write myself and a little bit more semi-personal, or like not personal in terms of biographical personal, but just stuff that, really has to kind of appeal to me as a story that I want to make that usually originates with me. And I didn't really think that there was a room for that, when I started making movies in Taiwan, but like obviously the last couple of years, like Asian American movies have really taken off. And it used to be that like I had an aversion to making kind of identity films, as like Asian American films sometimes are, but there's just so many films now that are Asian American, and they don't necessarily have to be identity films. They can just, I haven't seen Everything Everywhere All at Once yet, but like everything I've heard from friends is just like it's like everything that is great about it. So I think that there's so much room for that now, and if I had the right story to tell, I'd love to make not necessarily an Asian American film, but something that like would be personal to me. That would be an American film. Yeah. So in terms of North America or American and Taiwanese differences, Taiwanese film is still very much, for good or for bad, like it's very much like a director-driven films. Like the director has much more of it's still much more kind of like auteur cinema, in the sense that the director kind of is the one that kind of like oversees the production in a lot of ways. I also feel like the way Taiwanese films are made are still much more community oriented, in the sense that like everyone is, it's not just a job, everyone's like working together to create something, and that extends from like all the different departments all the way to like the creative people. Like it feels like much more aligned as like one thing. And I compare that really now with American films, because I just made one set in Taiwan. I think the American system that I worked under it's much more delineated and much more of like a delegated system, where like everyone has their job and everything is like much more regimented. And I don't really know if one is worse or better than the other, but I did feel that for sure, having done both now, which is that American films are just a lot more like structured, in the sense that like the director is just one piece of a structure, of a filmmaking structure, whereas in Taiwan it's still very much like a director working with a filmmaking community to create something.
All right, Mark Lil asks, what is the missing link between US filmmakers connecting with Taiwan productions? There's a lot of enthusiasm among Taiwanese Americans wanting to make projects in Taiwan, but it always seems like there is hesitancy from the Taiwan government organizations in connecting with them. What would make it easier to help make these co-productions happen, besides the obvious thing, money?
The missing link, I don't know, because there have been, I think in recent years, more of these kind of movies. Like I think Tiger Tail, for people who have seen Tiger Tail, is like one example of like an American film that has like shot in Taiwan and is about Taiwan. I will say, I think maybe one part of the issue is that I think for instance like Taiwanese government funding and stuff like that, I think there still is a certain people still kind of protect what a Taiwanese film is. And again, I don't think this is good or bad, but I do think like, for Taiwanese filmmakers and maybe for the government, they still are protective of like what it means to be a Taiwanese film. And maybe incorporating too many American elements to it threatens like the idea of what a Taiwanese movie is. And I think there just needs to be more examples of movies that break that mold for on both sides to realize like it doesn't have to be either or, and it's just a movie that happens to take place in Taiwan or has Taiwanese elements. I think the tricky part is with grants though, because like I know with a lot of filmmaking grants you have to be a Taiwanese citizen, and that's one reason it's harder to make maybe like a Taiwanese-American film if you're coming from the US to make something in Taiwan, because so many Taiwanese films, and this extends to commercial cinema, comes from grants. A lot of Taiwanese movies wouldn't get made without grants, so that's like a pretty big component of filmmaking in Taiwan.
Thank you. This question is from Brian. I'm an American living in Taiwan and work in post-production visual effects. With your bi-coastal experience, what are your thoughts on Taiwan and or Western post-production? Would love to see Taiwan doing more post-visual effects.
Yeah, I've only worked a little bit with like VFX houses in Taiwan. From what my understanding is, like, you know, things can be farmed out anywhere now, like especially like in the COVID world. Like I've been editing remote for both my movies, so I know that there's like there is no physicality anymore to like where things can be, you know, especially VFX can get done. I just think it's also a matter of I don't know if it's the Taiwanese government has to do more promotion for Taiwanese VFX companies, or vice versa, these production companies in Taiwan reaching out more to like, you know, Western VFX. But I do think it's like a thing where we don't have that physical border anymore about VFX. So from my understanding of it, and I haven't done enough VFX that much in my own movies, but it doesn't matter where it's done anymore. Just, you know, just have to find the right VFX house and the right taste. I know for the movie that we just shot, the North American one, Loveboat, that we just shot in Taipei, the post is everywhere. Like the editors in LA. I think the VFX is going to be done in Taiwan, but I think like then the sound mixing will be back in LA or Vancouver. So it's like really a model of like nothing has to be based anywhere anymore.
Great. And I thought we'd close out with a final question, going back to the title of this event, which is Taipei on Screen. All 4 of your feature films are shot and set in Taipei. And as someone who grew up in America, spent your formative years in the US, having your entire on-screen kind of representation being Taipei, what is it about this city that keeps you coming back? It's also the city that your mentor, Edward Yan, kept coming to. He was known for shooting the city of Taipei. And also, what is your identity as a bicultural, bilingual filmmaker with 1 foot in the US and 1 foot in Taiwan? Does that provide you with a kind of unique perspective on to see Taipei from maybe through a lens that others don't see?
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure it was like one of the first cities outside of the ones I had lived in as a kid that I guess my first city really as like a young man or young adult was Taipei. So I think just as a city with like that inspired me, that's kind of ingrained in me, like wanting to shoot there because it offered me so much when I was younger. I mean, over time, I think there's like a sense of security that like I know the city can be anything I want it to be. Like it can, you know, I've shot it as like kind of like a new wave you know, like new wave Paris, even though it was Taipei. I've shot it as like an American musical, even though it was Taipei. I've shot it as now this kind of sad night, like, you know, romantic. In my movie Mama Boy, I've shot it like, you know, that way. And then in this totally American young adult movie, I've shot it as like this like kind of playground for Asian American kids coming back for the summer in like a different way. So something about that, just finding ways for it to inspire me in like different visually and story wise, like it keeps giving me all these like different opportunities to tell the story in the same different way. I mean, there's one location that we repeated that I shot in Au Revoir Taipei that we repeated in my 4th movie, and it's shot like in a totally different way under a totally different context. And so something about that is just kind of liberating to me. But I do have to say I do want to start shooting in other places just because I feel like I'm also exhausting that inspiration I had like 10 years ago. Like it's running on limited supply now. But yeah, I just like also I'm always seeing that city as like somewhat outsider and somewhat who also is, now I can say I do live there and I am a piece of me is from there. So it's always been nice having that too. Just like it's not there's still like a uniqueness to it just because I didn't grow up there. So that always keeps something that's really interesting to me too.
Great. So to our viewers, Mama Boy coming out soon. Loveboat Taipei. When is that going to hit theaters?
I think it'll probably be out by the end of the year, hopefully. But Mama Boy definitely is going to be out in the next couple of months.
And where can our audience stream your first two features?
Au Revoir Taipei is tricky to find. It came out like in the pre-streaming era. It might be on some platforms, but very like some countries have it on Netflix, but I don't think North America does. Wisdom of Tomorrow, you can find like I think on iTunes. It is on Netflix in some countries, but like iTunes or Amazon, I think Google Play, like I think pretty easy to find.
Okay. Well, I encourage our audience, if you haven't seen Arvin's films, check them out. And thank you so much, Arvin, for taking almost 2 hours with us to
No problem.
share some of the insights about your life and career. And an advertisement, in about 2 weeks, we're having another lecture in this series with Fiona Ron, who just did American Girl, which is streaming on Netflix now. So you can watch American Girl and join us in a few weeks.
Yeah, American Girl is awesome. It's a fantastic movie. So yeah, hope everyone can, and it's easy to see. It's on Netflix.
Yeah. So we hope to see some of you back for that event. Again, thank you to Esther Zhou, Assistant Director of Center for Chinese Studies, Taiwan Academy, and of course our audience and our featured guest, Arvin Chen. So thank